Imagine setting sail from a familiar shore, the wooden hull of your ship cutting through gentle waves under a clear sky. You are part of an empire that spans continents, a civilization built on trade, conquest, and connection. Yet, with every mile you venture from land, you are moving further away from safety and deeper into the most dangerous environment our ancestors ever faced. This was the reality for countless people in the ancient world, where the greatest threat to a thriving society was not a rival army with gleaming swords, but the vast, unpredictable, and utterly merciless sea. We often picture ancient dangers as battles and invasions, dramatic conflicts where strength and strategy could determine the outcome. But history tells a different, far more terrifying story. The ocean was a silent conqueror, a force of nature that could erase fleets, decimate populations, and topple empires without a single sword ever being drawn. It was a realm where human courage and planning were often meaningless against the sheer power of the deep. In this video, we are going to explore why the sea was more dangerous than the sword in ancient times. We will journey back through historical accounts and uncover the brutal truths faced by Phoenician traders, Roman soldiers, and Greek explorers. We will delve into the technological limitations that left them vulnerable, from ships that could be shattered by a sudden storm to navigation methods that relied on stars often hidden by clouds. We will reveal how nature's fury, in the form of hurricanes and rogue waves, could accomplish what no enemy army ever could: the complete and total destruction of a mission, a supply line, or an entire fleet. This is a story of human vulnerability, a reminder that for all our achievements, we have always been at the mercy of forces far greater than ourselves. So prepare to rethink everything you know about the perils of the ancient world. We will uncover how maritime diseases could turn a ship into a floating tomb, how a simple error in reading the currents could lead a crew to a slow and agonizing end, and how the psychological torment of isolation and the fear of the unknown could break the strongest wills. This is a journey into the heart of a historical mystery, to a time when the waves held more power than the mightiest armies. Join us as we set sail into the past to discover why the sea was the true, silent conqueror of the ancient world. Imagine standing on the deck of an ancient trading vessel, the coastline a fading memory behind you. Ahead lies not just water, but a vast, living entity of immense power and profound indifference. For the sailors of antiquity, every voyage was a confrontation with this raw, untamable force. On land, a general could survey a battlefield, understand the lay of the land, and deploy his troops with some measure of control. The enemy was another human, a mind that could be outwitted, a force that could be countered. But the sea had no mind to outthink. It was an opponent that could not be reasoned with, bargained with, or predicted. Its moods shifted from serene calm to murderous rage in moments, and its only language was overwhelming force. A Roman legionary might face a Gaulish warrior with confidence in his training and armor, but a Phoenician merchant facing a North African gale had nothing but hope and a few prayers to his name. The fundamental difference was this: land warfare was a test of human will against human will. Naval travel was a test of human frailty against the absolute power of nature. This hostility was baked into the very experience of ancient seafaring. There were no weather reports, no satellite images to warn of a brewing storm hundreds of miles away. A clear sky at dawn could transform into a nightmare of howling wind and towering waves by noon. The ocean floor was a realm of pure mystery, its depths hiding sharp reefs and sudden drop-offs that could tear the hull out from under a ship without a moment's notice. Currents, those invisible rivers within the sea, could seize a vessel and carry it far off its intended course, into uncharted waters or towards a hostile shore. This constant, low-level anxiety was the background hum of every journey. Every creak of the timbers, every shift in the wind, was scrutinized for signs of impending disaster. The sea didn't just present physical dangers, it imposed a relentless psychological burden, a feeling of vulnerability that no land army, no matter how outnumbered, ever had to endure in quite the same way. We see this reality reflected again and again in the historical records that have survived. The Greeks told stories of entire fleets, like those of the Persian king Xerxes, being dashed against the rocks by sudden storms, a loss of life and material that crippled military campaigns before a single arrow was fired. Roman historians like Tacitus documented the frequent loss of supply ships carrying grain from Egypt, a logistical catastrophe that could spark famine and riots in the heart of the empire. A sunken ship meant more than just lost sailors. It could mean a city going hungry, an army being left without pay, or a crucial political alliance crumbling because an ambassador never arrived. The sea didn't just kill people, it severed the vital arteries that connected and sustained ancient civilizations. This absolute lack of mercy shaped not just individual lives, but the grand strategies of kings and emperors, who often viewed naval expeditions as necessary gambles rather than sure bets, knowing that the greatest threat to their ambition wasn't the enemy's sword, but the ocean's bottomless appetite. Now consider the sheer suddenness of these storms. A trader's vessel could be gliding smoothly on a shimmering blue expanse one moment, and the very next, the world would dissolve into a chaos of screaming wind and water. There was no gradual buildup, no modern radar to offer a precious hour of preparation. The first sign might be a darkening of the horizon, a line of ominous black clouds rushing toward you with a speed that defied belief. For the crew, the response was a frantic, desperate scramble, reefing the sails, securing any loose cargo, and praying to every god they could name. But these actions were often utterly futile against the ocean's unleashed fury. The primary construction material was wood, and the primary fastener was often just rope or brittle iron nails. Under the immense strain of a storm, hulls could simply flex and buckle, their seams opening to the relentless rush of the sea. A single massive wave, what we might call a rogue wave today, could crash over the deck, sweeping men and supplies into the abyss or, even worse, filling the ship's belly with water and dragging it down into the depths in a matter of minutes. The scale of loss was staggering and could eclipse the casualties of a major land battle in a single, terrible event. We have accounts from the Roman world, for instance, of entire supply fleets being lost to autumn storms in the Mediterranean. In one famous disaster, a fleet carrying grain from Alexandria to Rome was caught in a tempest off the coast of Sicily. Historians suggest that hundreds of ships and thousands of men, along with enough grain to feed the city of Rome for months, were swallowed by the sea in just 1 or 2 days. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a geopolitical event that could destabilize an empire, causing famine and civil unrest far from the shore. Compare this to the controlled environment of a land battle. A general on a battlefield could choose his ground, retreat to a more defensible position, or sue for peace. He faced an adversary who could tire, make a mistake, or feel fear. The storm felt none of these things. It was an impersonal, mindless engine of destruction, and it offered no quarter. It was the ultimate expression of nature's overwhelming power over human ambition, a reminder that for all their empire building and military conquests, ancient civilizations were perpetually one bad squall away from catastrophic failure. Now imagine that storm has passed and you've survived. The sky is clear again, the waves have settled, but a new and more insidious dread begins to creep in. You look around at a featureless expanse of water in every direction, identical in every way. There are no roads here, no signposts, no distant mountains to guide your way. You are utterly, completely lost. This was the terrifying reality of primitive navigation, a danger that was in many ways more psychologically torturous than any storm. A tempest was a violent, active threat, but being lost at sea was a slow, passive unraveling of hope, a quiet sentence to drift until supplies ran out or you stumbled into something worse. On land, if a Roman legion took a wrong turn, they could interrogate a local, find a known river, or simply backtrack. Their world was mapped, known, and filled with reference points. For the ancient mariner, the ocean was a trackless desert, and the tools to cross it were pitifully inadequate. Their primary method of navigation was celestial, relying on the sun by day and the stars by night. During the day, they might use a simple gnomon, a stick that cast a shadow, to get a rough sense of direction. At night, they knew the constellations. The Phoenicians, some of the ancient world's greatest sailors, are believed to have used the North Star to guide them, keeping it on their left side as they sailed west from the Levant. But this system had catastrophic flaws. What happened when the sky was overcast for days on end? The sun and stars would vanish, leaving a crew directionless, at the complete mercy of the currents. A ship could be pushed hundreds of miles off course without anyone on board even realizing it. They might think they were sailing straight for a friendly port, only to find themselves approaching the rocky shores of a hostile territory, or, even worse, being pulled out into the deep, open Atlantic with no hope of return. This is where myth and reality blurred terrifyingly. The epic tales of heroes like Odysseus were not just fantasy, they were a reflection of a very real, widely shared fear. Homer's Odyssey is essentially a 10-year story of catastrophic navigation errors. Odysseus and his men are constantly blown off course, misled by gods, and tricked by monsters, all because they cannot reliably find their way home. For ancient sailors, these stories were a stark warning. The sea wasn't just filled with physical hazards, it was populated by the psychological terror of the unknown. Whirlpools like Charybdis weren't just literary devices, they were based on exaggerated accounts of real tidal currents that could indeed pull a small ship under. The Strait of Messina between Italy and Sicily was particularly feared for this reason. To be lost was to risk sailing straight into the legends that haunted your nightmares. The contrast with land travel could not be more stark. A Roman army on the march moved along engineered roads like the Appian Way. They had detailed itineraria, lists of towns and way stations with the distances between them. They could send scouts ahead on horseback to report back on the terrain. Their world was measured, documented, and predictable. A sailor had none of this. Their maps, when they existed at all, were called peripli, basically written descriptions of coastlines. They would note that after 3 days of sailing past a certain river mouth, you would see a distinctive mountain. But if you missed that mountain because of fog or a storm, the entire document became useless. A single error in dead reckoning, the process of estimating your position based on speed and direction, could compound over days to create a navigational disaster. On land, a wrong turn was a mistake. At sea, a wrong calculation was often a death sentence for everyone on board, a testament to a technological helplessness that made the ocean a far more unpredictable and deadly adversary than any human enemy armed with a sword. Even the most brilliantly designed ancient vessel was, at its core, a fragile wooden shell pitted against an immense and unforgiving ocean. These ships were incredible achievements of their age, capable of carrying tons of cargo or hundreds of men across vast distances. But their construction methods, while ingenious, contained inherent weaknesses that the sea was all too eager to exploit. Unlike the solid, carved hulls of later centuries, many ancient Mediterranean ships were built using the shell-first method. This meant that the planks of the hull were fastened together first, with the internal framing added afterward. The planks were often joined with mortise and tenon joints, essentially wooden tabs and slots that were pegged together. This created a strong but somewhat flexible hull. The problem was that this flexibility had its limits. In heavy seas, the entire structure would flex and twist, a process known as working. Over time, this constant motion could loosen the fastenings, whether they were wooden pegs, rope lashings, or metal nails. A seam would open up, and the cold water would begin to trickle, then pour into the hold. This vulnerability was compounded by other natural enemies. The teredo navalis, or shipworm, was a silent scourge. These clam-like mollusks would bore into the wooden hull, devouring it from the inside out. A ship that looked perfectly sound on the outside could be riddled with a honeycomb of tunnels, critically weakening its structure. Then there was rot. The lower sections of the hull, constantly wet, provided a perfect environment for fungal growth that would slowly eat away at the timber. A crew might spend days bailing out water, not from a new leak, but from the gradual seepage through thousands of tiny holes and softened wood. The primary defense against this was the bilge pump, but ancient versions were woefully inadequate. They were often simple hand-operated devices made of wood or leather, capable of moving only a small amount of water with each laborious stroke. A moderate leak could easily outpace the efforts of a team of exhausted men working in shifts. Once water began to accumulate in the bilges, it lowered the ship's stability, making it ride lower in the water and more susceptible to being swamped by the next wave, creating a terrifying and inescapable feedback loop toward disaster. We have stark historical evidence of how these structural failures could lead to catastrophe. The Roman writer Lucian provides a chillingly mundane account of a large grain carrier, the Isis, that found itself in trouble not in a storm but simply in rough weather. The ship began to leak from multiple points, and the crew and passengers, including Lucian himself, were forced into a frantic, round-the-clock bailout operation. They used every container available, pumps, buckets, even their own shoes, in a desperate battle against the rising water. They only survived by a stroke of luck, managing to find a safe harbor before the ship was completely overwhelmed. Countless other vessels were not so fortunate. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks across the Mediterranean shows ships that literally broke in half under the strain of the waves, their cargoes of amphorae spilling out in a trail along the seafloor, marking their final, desperate moments. The contrast with land-based dangers is profoundly revealing. A Roman legionary on a long campaign might march hundreds of miles. His gear, his sword, his armor, these were his lifelines. If his sword broke, a blacksmith could reforge it. If his sandals wore out, he could get new ones. The army traveled with a logistical tale that included craftsmen capable of repairing almost anything. But on a ship in the middle of the sea, there was no such safety net. If a critical rope parted, it couldn't be replaced. If the mast splintered, it was a catastrophe. There was no dockyard to haul the vessel out of the water to fix a leak. Repairs at sea were makeshift, desperate, and often temporary. A soldier fought with tools he could maintain. A sailor sailed in a home that could, and frequently did, fail him utterly. This fundamental fragility meant that every single voyage was a gamble with the highest possible stakes. The sea didn't need a storm to kill. Sometimes, all it took was a persistent leak on a calm day and a bilge pump that couldn't keep up, slowly transforming a majestic ship into a waterlogged coffin for its crew. And if the ship itself didn't fail you, the people lurking upon it certainly would. Beyond the impersonal wrath of nature, ancient sailors faced a very human and calculated danger: piracy. This wasn't the romanticized swashbuckling of later eras. It was a brutal, ruthless enterprise that turned well-traveled sea lanes into hunting grounds. Maritime raiders, often based in secluded coves on rugged coastlines, knew the routes of wealthy merchants and slow-moving supply ships intimately. They would lie in wait, their own lighter, faster vessels hidden behind an island or a headland, ready to strike at the perfect moment. Their targets were typically overloaded and underdefended, their crews exhausted from weeks at sea and in no condition to put up a serious fight. The goal was swift, overwhelming violence, to board, seize control, and disappear with the cargo and any valuable prisoners before any naval patrol could respond. The fundamental difference between piracy and land-based banditry was the sheer scale of the operational theater and the complete lack of authority. On a major Roman road like the Via Appia, there were milestones, way stations, and occasionally even military patrols. A merchant caravan might hire guards for protection, creating a deterrent, but the Mediterranean Sea was unimaginably vast and almost entirely unpoliceable by ancient standards. A pirate ship could operate with near-total impunity for months, striking hundreds of miles apart and then vanishing back into the countless inlets of a foreign shore. There were no coast guards, no distress signals, and no hope of immediate reinforcement. For a merchant ship, the moment a strange sail appeared on the horizon was a moment of pure dread. Was it a fellow trader, or was it death approaching on the wind? This uncertainty itself was a form of psychological warfare, a constant background fear that colored every voyage. Perhaps no single story illustrates the audacity and reach of ancient pirates better than the tale of a young Julius Caesar. As a 25-year-old nobleman traveling across the Aegean Sea, his ship was intercepted by a fleet of Cilician pirates. These were not simple fishermen turned opportunistic thieves. They were a sophisticated and powerful criminal organization based on the southern coast of Anatolia, effectively controlling large swaths of the eastern Mediterranean. They captured Caesar and, according to the historian Plutarch, upon learning his identity, demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver. Caesar famously laughed at them, insulted by the low figure, and insisted they ask for 50. For 38 days he lived among them as they waited for the ransom to arrive, treating the pirates not as his captors but as his unintelligent subordinates. He would participate in their games, write speeches and poetry, and freely tell them that upon his release he would return to hunt them down and crucify every last one of them. They took it all as a joke, but Caesar was deadly serious. The ransom was paid, he was released, and true to his word, he immediately raised a fleet, sailed back to their stronghold, captured most of them, and reclaimed his 50 talents. Before having them crucified, he showed a touch of mercy, or perhaps dark humor, by having their throats cut first to shorten their suffering. This incident underscores a terrifying truth. If pirates could capture a figure as connected and formidable as Julius Caesar, no one was safe. Their power was a humiliating challenge to the very authority of Rome itself. The nature of combat in these encounters was another source of terror, completely unlike the structured chaos of a land battle. A legionary fought in a formation, a testudo or a battle line. He had comrades on his left and right, clear commands from his centurion, and a sense of a unified front. A naval ambush was pure, disorienting chaos. Pirates aimed not to engage in a prolonged fight but to board as quickly as possible. They would use grappling hooks to pull the victim ship close, and then a wave of armed men would pour over the rails. The fight that followed was a close-quarters melee in a wildly unstable environment, a slippery, rolling deck crowded with rigging and cargo. There were no lines, no formations, just a desperate, savage scramble in which every man was on his own. The crew of the merchant ship, often outnumbered and outarmed by professional fighters, stood little chance, and unlike on land, where a soldier might break and run from the battlefield, there was nowhere to run at sea. Surrender was no guarantee of safety either. To leave no witnesses who could identify them or testify against them, pirates were notorious for their brutality, often slaughtering the entire crew and scuttling the ship to erase all evidence of their crime. This practice made a pirate attack not just a robbery, but a near-certain death sentence for everyone on board, adding a layer of existential horror that far exceeded the risks of a roadside robbery. Now let's step onto the deck of a ship that has been at sea for weeks. The initial fear of the storm has passed, the dread of pirates has faded into the monotony of the horizon, and a new, more insidious enemy has begun its siege. This adversary wasn't violent or loud. It was quiet, patient, and utterly relentless, the slow, grinding scarcity of food and fresh water. Imagine the profound isolation of that reality. On land, an army on the march could live off the land. They could hunt game, forage for roots and berries, commandeer supplies from villages, or even set up supply depots along a secured route. A Roman legion was a mobile, self-sufficient community that could source its needs from the environment. But on the open ocean there was nothing. No fields to raid, no streams to drink from, no villages to barter with. The ship was a sealed, floating world, and everything needed for survival had to be packed into its hold at the beginning of the journey. Once those supplies were gone, there was absolutely nothing between the crew and a slow, agonizing death. The logistics of provisioning an ancient voyage were a nightmare of estimation and hope. The most critical commodity was fresh water. It was typically stored in large, porous clay jars called amphorae or in wooden casks. Both methods were terribly flawed. Clay jars, while good for storing wine or oil, were porous and allowed water to evaporate slowly, and they could easily crack or seep. Wooden casks, if not perfectly crafted, could leak or, even worse, impart a foul taste to the water as it stagnated over weeks. Without any understanding of sterilization, the water would quickly become a breeding ground for algae, bacteria, and parasites. A sailor might take a drink to quench his thirst, only to contract a vicious case of dysentery that would dehydrate him faster than the water could save him. Precious liquid would slowly turn green and slimy, but the choice was to drink it or die of thirst. They had no means to desalinate seawater, so the immense, undrinkable ocean surrounding them became a cruel joke, an endless expanse of water that only accelerated their thirst. Food presented a similar set of desperate challenges. The standard rations were hardtack, a rock-solid biscuit made from flour and water, dried legumes, salted meat or fish, and a little wine or beer. These preservation methods were primitive at best. Salted meat, if not perfectly cured, could rot. Hardtack was infamous for becoming a home to weevils and other pests. Sailors would often tap their biscuits on the table to knock the insects out before eating them. In the damp, humid environment of a ship's hold, mold could quickly ruin entire stores of food. A voyage that was delayed by unfavorable winds or that veered off course could stretch from weeks into months. The carefully calculated rations would dwindle, and the captain would be forced to impose strict rationing. Hunger became a constant companion, a dull ache that grew sharper with each passing day. But starvation was only part of the threat. the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables meant sailors were chronically deficient in essential vitamins, most notably vitamin C. This deficiency led to scurvy, a horrific disease that would begin with lethargy and joint pain, then progress to the swelling and bleeding of gums, the loosening of teeth, and the opening of old wounds. It left men weak, anemic, and utterly helpless, transforming a crew of strong sailors into a ship full of invalids, incapable of handling the sails or pumping out bilge water. We have haunting accounts from historical logs that detail the depths of this desperation. There are records of crews driven mad by thirst, ignoring the certain death that awaited them and drinking seawater. This act, which increases the salt concentration in the blood and forces the body to expel even more water to process it, leads to a rapid and horrific demise through accelerated dehydration and delirium. Others resorted to chewing on leather straps, their own sandals, anything made of animal hide, in a futile attempt to trick their stomachs into feeling full. Some stories even tell of sailors cutting pieces of wax from the seals of water casks to suck on, just for the sensation of having something in their mouths. These were not acts of irrational madness, but the logical end result of a body and mind pushed far beyond their limits. The ship, once a vessel of adventure and trade, became a floating tomb, adrift under a silent sun, its occupants slowly wasting away with the full, terrifying awareness of their fate. This slow unraveling of life, this daily negotiation with despair, was a psychological torment that many ancient sources suggest was feared far more than the quick, clean end offered by a sword in battle. But the danger of starvation was only the beginning of the nightmare. Even if the food and water held out, the very environment of the ship conspired against the health of every soul on board. Picture the conditions below deck. A dark, cramped space, constantly damp from sea spray and bilge water, with little ventilation to clear the thick, heavy air. Dozens of men lived, slept, and ate in this confined area for weeks or months on end. There was no concept of sanitation. Waste was tossed overboard or sometimes just left in a corner to fester. The drinking water, stored in porous clay jars, became a murky soup of bacteria. Food spoiled quickly in the humid heat, and weevils infested the hardtack biscuits. This was the perfect breeding ground for disease, an invisible enemy far more efficient and deadly than any human foe armed with a sword. Without any understanding of germ theory, the crew's own habits accelerated the spread of sickness. Men shared the same cups for drinking water and the same bowls for their meager meals, unknowingly passing contagions from one to another. Contaminated water was the primary vector for dysentery and typhoid fever, diseases that ravaged the body with relentless vomiting, crippling cramps, and severe dehydration that could kill a strong man in a matter of days. Lice and fleas thriving in the cramped, unwashed living quarters spread typhus known as ship fever, which brought high fevers, delirium, and a characteristic spotted rash. The medical care available was virtually non-existent, often limited to a captain or mate with a rudimentary knowledge of herbal remedies or, more gruesomely, amputation. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptics, and no way to isolate the sick. An outbreak on a ship was a death sentence for many, as the diseased were left to suffer alongside the healthy, ensuring the contagion would continue its relentless spread. The historical records are filled with chilling accounts of these floating charnel houses. There are stories of trading vessels from Alexandria, their holds still packed with valuable grain and papyrus, drifting into port with only a handful of emaciated survivors left to tell the tale of the plague that had taken the rest. A warship might successfully complete its mission, only to return to its home port with its sails hanging limp, its oars still, and its deck littered with the bodies of its crew, felled not by enemy action but by an unseen microbe. The economic and human cost was staggering. A sunken ship was a total loss, but a ship that arrived with its cargo intact and its crew dead represented a different kind of tragedy, a victory for commerce that was also a catastrophic defeat for humanity. This highlights the starkest difference between the perils of the sea and those of the land. When disease struck a land army, there were options. Commanders could establish field hospitals away from the front lines, quarantining the sick to some degree. If an area was known to be unhealthy, like a swampy river valley buzzing with malaria-carrying mosquitoes, the army could simply march away from it. They had the power of movement over a vast and varied landscape. On a ship, there was no such recourse. The sick could not be isolated. Everyone breathed the same contaminated air. There was no marching away from the outbreak. The ship itself was the outbreak zone, and the only way out was to finish the voyage or perish trying. The crew was trapped in a wooden prison with an invisible killer, a reality that made the sea a uniquely potent force of destruction. This invisible biological warfare claimed more ancient lives than the clash of armies, a silent, suffocating terror that no sword could ever hope to defeat. While the physical dangers of the ancient sea were formidable, they were often rivaled by a more insidious threat that preyed not on the body, but on the mind itself. Imagine the psychological toll of being utterly alone on that vast, featureless expanse for weeks or even months on end. There is a unique form of madness that can blossom in such profound isolation, a creeping despair born from the relentless monotony of water and sky. With no distant mountains, no changing landscapes, and no other people to break the line of sight, a sailor's world shrank to the cramped confines of his ship, surrounded by an infinite, empty horizon that offered no comfort, only a reminder of his own insignificance. This sensory deprivation could unravel the strongest wills, leading to severe disorientation and a deep, aching loneliness that land-based soldiers, surrounded by the camaraderie of their unit and the solid earth beneath their feet, could scarcely comprehend. This mental erosion often manifested as intense paranoia and superstitious dread. When the human mind is deprived of concrete information, it desperately seeks patterns and meaning in the unknown. Every strange noise from the creaking hull became the groan of a sea monster lurking in the depths. A sudden patch of fog was not just weather, but a malevolent spirit sent to lead them astray. The ancient seas were not just bodies of water to these men. They were realms inhabited by capricious and vengeful gods, terrifying monsters, and the restless ghosts of drowned sailors. The Greeks feared the wrath of Poseidon, who could stir up a storm with a trident's thrust. Norse sailors told tales of the monstrous kraken, a beast so large it could pull an entire ship into the abyss. These weren't mere stories told for entertainment around a fire. They were deeply held beliefs that shaped every decision and fueled a constant, low-level terror. A flash of bioluminescence in the water at night wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was the glowing eye of a demon. This layer of supernatural fear turned every voyage into a psychological gauntlet, where the line between reality and terrifying imagination was constantly blurred. This potent combination of isolation and superstition had very real and often disastrous consequences for a ship's crew. The constant, unpredictable motion of the vessel on the waves could induce a state of perpetual unease and nausea, further eroding mental stability. In such a pressurized environment, trust among the crew was fragile. A simple misunderstanding or a run of bad luck could be interpreted as a sign that someone on board had angered the gods or was secretly cursed. This could easily spiral into accusations, scapegoating, and even mutiny, as documented in sagas from the Vikings and tales from the Mediterranean. There are accounts of crews throwing a supposedly unlucky sailor overboard in a desperate attempt to appease the sea and change their fortune. Unlike a land army where a clear chain of command and shared purpose could reinforce discipline, a ship's company was a tinderbox of fear and suspicion. The sea didn't need to break the ship itself to claim its victims. It could simply break the minds of the men aboard, turning them against each other and ensuring their own destruction. This mental anguish was perhaps the most cunning weapon in the ocean's arsenal, a silent storm that raged within the human psyche long before any clouds gathered on the horizon. While the loss of human life was the most immediate tragedy of a maritime disaster, the economic aftershocks could ripple outwards, toppling merchants, starving cities, and even destabilizing entire empires. A sunken ship was far more than a loss of life. It was the instantaneous and total erasure of capital. Imagine a wealthy merchant in ancient Alexandria, perhaps a man who had invested his entire family's fortune into a single, massive shipment of papyrus, glassware, and grain. He had hired the crew, paid for provisions, and watched his vessel, laden with his hopes and his wealth, disappear over the horizon. Weeks later, instead of the promised return of his ship and the lucrative sale of his goods, he would receive only silence. There would be no wreckage to salvage, no insurance claim to file, no bodies to bury. His entire investment, along with the livelihoods of everyone who depended on that voyage, was simply gone, swallowed by the indifferent sea. For an individual, this meant utter financial ruin, a plunge from prosperity into destitution from which there was no recovery. The scale of this vulnerability expanded dramatically when applied to the lifelines of entire cities. The ancient world was deeply interconnected by these maritime supply chains. Rome, for instance, was a megalopolis that famously relied on grain shipments from Egypt and North Africa to feed its massive, non-farming population. Historians estimate that the city required thousands of tons of grain each month, all of it arriving by sea. The entire political stability of the empire hinged on this steady, uninterrupted flow. The Roman government even had a special official, the Praefectus Annani, whose sole job was to manage this grain supply. Now, picture the catastrophe if a storm in the Mediterranean, perhaps near the treacherous Strait of Messina, caught an entire convoy of these grain freighters. A single autumn gale could wipe out a dozen ships in one afternoon. The news would take weeks to reach Rome, arriving not as a formal report but as a chilling emptiness in the harbors and a sudden, sharp spike in the price of bread. The result was not mere economic inconvenience, it was existential crisis. The Roman plebs, the common citizens who received subsidized grain, would suddenly find the distributions halted or drastically reduced. Hunger would quickly turn to anger. The forums and streets would fill with restless, desperate crowds, their frustration directed squarely at the emperor and his government. History records numerous instances of bread riots in Rome that were triggered by just such a maritime interruption. These were not minor disturbances, they were events that could threaten the very reign of an emperor who was expected to guarantee both bread and circuses. A lost battle on the distant Germanic frontier could be spun by propagandists as a temporary setback or a heroic sacrifice, but an empty granary in the heart of the city was an undeniable, visceral failure that every citizen felt in their stomach. The sea, without a single enemy soldier or general, could accomplish what barbarian hordes rarely could. It could bring the heart of the empire to its knees through sheer economic strangulation. This highlights the fundamental difference between the economic impact of land-based threats and maritime ones. A land raid by a rival tribe could certainly be devastating, burning fields and stealing livestock from a village or two. The damage was often localized and crucially repairable. Crops could be replanted the next season, stolen herds could be rebuilt over time. The trauma was real, but the means of production, the land itself, remained. A sunken ship, however, represented a total and instantaneous loss of finished goods, capital, and human expertise. It erased an entire link in the supply chain in a way that was often irreplaceable. The specific cargo might be gone forever, the skilled sailors who manned the vessel were lost, and the merchant who funded the venture was bankrupt, meaning no future voyages would be financed. The sea didn't just attack the fruit on the branch, it could annihilate the entire tree, roots and all. This made maritime trade the ultimate high-stakes gamble of the ancient world, where a roll of the dice against nature's fury could determine whether a city ate or starved, whether a merchant dynasty endured or vanished without a trace. While the fury of a storm was a dramatic and visible threat, the sea held far more subtle and insidious traps for the unwary sailor. Beyond the open water, the transition zones between deep ocean and shoreline were particularly lethal, littered with environmental hazards that remained completely invisible until the moment they claimed another victim. A captain guiding his ship toward what he believed was a safe harbor had to navigate a final, deadly obstacle course. Uncharted reefs of sharp coral or jagged rock could lie just feet below the surface, invisible in the murky water, ready to gut the hull of a ship like a knife. In regions like the North Sea, vast and shifting sandbanks could appear or disappear with the tides, ensnaring vessels that drew even a little too much water. A ship that ran aground on a sandbank was often doomed. If the impact itself didn't break its back, it would be left helplessly listing, a sitting duck for the next rising tide to pound it to pieces against the unforgiving seabed. Adding another layer of terror was the weather phenomenon that could blind a crew at the most critical moment, the sudden, dense fog bank. Without radar or sonar, a ship enveloped in fog was completely disoriented, its crew deafened by the damp silence and blinded by the impenetrable whiteness. The sound of crashing waves or crying gulls, normally a warning of proximity to land, would be muffled and distorted, giving no clear sense of direction. In such conditions, a vessel could drift silently and unknowingly straight onto a rocky headland or into the path of another lost ship. This was a danger that negated all skill and experience, reducing navigation to pure, helpless chance at the very moment when precision was most desperately needed. Then there were the forces of the water itself, so powerful they became mythologized. The whirlpools and ferocious currents described in tales like the Odyssey were not mere fiction. Places like the Strait of Messina between Sicily and the Italian mainland were notorious for their violent tidal currents, where colliding bodies of water could create treacherous whirlpools and standing waves. To ancient sailors, these phenomena were the work of monsters like Scylla and Charybdis. A smaller vessel caught in a powerful whirlpool could indeed be pulled under, while a strong current could seize a ship and, no matter how hard the crew fought at the oars, dash it against nearby cliffs with irresistible force. These were not obstacles that could be stormed or outmaneuvered like a land-based fortification. They were elemental powers that simply had to be avoided, and the margin for error was vanishingly small. The critical difference between these maritime hazards and the obstacles of land warfare was their invisibility and unpredictability. A Roman general planning a march would have scouts report on the terrain ahead. They would know about a mountain range they needed to cross or a river they needed to ford. They could plan for these challenges, build bridges, or choose an easier path. The land was largely known and mapped. The sea, however, was a secretive and constantly changing opponent. A reef that was safely underwater 1 month could be a ship-killing menace the next after a storm shifted the sands. A current that was gentle one day could be raging the next due to distant weather systems no one could foresee. There were no reliable charts, only stories and rough sketches passed down from sailor to sailor, each one potentially outdated or exaggerated. This meant that even a well-traveled, familiar route could hold a deadly surprise, a natural trap that had lain in wait for centuries, claiming victims who never knew what hit them until their ship was already breaking apart. Now consider the chaotic reality of an ancient naval battle, a scene of unimaginable confusion where the very elements conspired against any semblance of order or strategy. On land, a general could position his legions on high ground, form disciplined lines, and execute complex maneuvers with relative control. But on the water, none of that was possible. The primary tactic perfected by powers like Athens was the deepless, a daring maneuver where a ship would sprint through a gap in the enemy's line, turn sharply, and ram an opponent's vessel amidships. It was a move that required incredible skill, timing, and above all, a stable platform. But the Mediterranean was rarely a stable platform. A sudden gust of wind, an unexpected current, or even a large wave could throw off the approach entirely. The attacking ship might miss its target completely, or worse, collide at a wrong angle, shattering its own bronze-reinforced ram or becoming hopelessly entangled with its intended victim. In the heat of battle, what was meant to be a decisive strike could instantly become a catastrophic accident, leaving both ships crippled and adrift amidst the chaos. This inherent instability turned every naval engagement into a lottery where luck often outweighed skill. The Battle of Salamis in 480 BCE is celebrated as a brilliant Greek victory, a turning point that saved the fledgling democracy from Persian conquest. But the historical accounts, including those from the Greek playwright Aeschylus who fought there, reveal a far messier truth. While the Greek triremes outmaneuvered the larger Persian fleet in the narrow straits, a significant number of ships were lost not to enemy rams, but to simple, brutal collisions with each other. In the tight quarters, with hundreds of vessels crammed together, it was nearly impossible to maintain any formation. A ship attempting to ram might be blindsided by a friendly vessel pushed off course by the current. Oars became tangled, locking ships together in a deadly embrace that made them easy targets. The sea itself became a third combatant, an unpredictable and impartial force that could just as easily dash a Persian ship against the rocks as a Greek one. The victory was real, but the cost was inflated by the environment's utter indifference to the plans of admirals. The contrast with the controlled chaos of a land battle could not be more stark. A Roman sentry on the battlefield was a masterclass in order. Each man had his designated place in the formation. Commands were relayed clearly through horns and standards, and the terrain, while challenging, was solid and knowable. A soldier knew who the enemy was and where they were. In a naval melee, that clarity vanished. The deck of a warship was a slippery, heaving platform, crowded with marines, rowers, and sailors. The smoke from fires, the spray of the sea, and the general pandemonium made it difficult to see more than a few yards. Was that ship approaching a friend or a foe? Was that signal flag from the admiral's ship or an enemy trick? The wind could change in an instant, robbing a fleet of its mobility and leaving it stranded, its oars useless against the gale. A land army could dig in and hold its ground. A navy was always at the mercy of the currents, a fickle ally that could abandon you at the worst possible moment. This fundamental lack of control made naval warfare an exercise in managed catastrophe, where the winner was often not the side with the best strategy, but the one that made the fewest fatal errors against an opponent that was not the other fleet, but the sea itself. Now consider the profound, almost unimaginable isolation that descended the moment a ship's coastline faded from view. On land, even in the most remote frontier outpost, a Roman commander could dispatch a rider on the fastest horse available. That messenger could cover dozens of miles in a day, carrying crucial orders, requests for reinforcements, or vital intelligence. A response, while not immediate, could be expected within a known time frame, perhaps a week or two. This system of communication, though slow by our standards, created a tangible tether to command, to supply, and to civilization itself. But once a vessel slipped beyond the horizon, that tether was severed completely. The ship entered a state of informational blackout, becoming a silent, solitary world adrift in a vast and trackless blue. For the weeks or months of its voyage, it ceased to exist in the minds of those on land. There was no way to send a message ahead to report a delay, no method to call for help if disaster struck, and no means to receive updated orders that might have been issued the day after it sailed. This absolute communication breakdown had devastating practical consequences for military and commercial operations alike. A fleet dispatched on a specific mission could be rendered utterly useless by a simple change in circumstances it could never know about. Imagine a squadron of Roman warships sent to intercept an enemy fleet rumored to be near Cyprus. After a long and perilous journey, they arrive at the designated coordinates only to find empty sea. Unbeknownst to them, their target changed course a week prior, or perhaps was never there to begin with. The admiral has no new orders. Does he return home, wasting the entire costly expedition? Does he sail on blindly, hoping to stumble upon his quarry, all the while consuming his limited supplies? The decision is a desperate gamble made in an informational vacuum. Similarly, a merchant vessel might sail for a port that has, in the intervening weeks, been struck by a plague or fallen to a siege. It would arrive to find no market for its goods, or worse, a hostile welcome. Its journey and its investment rendered completely pointless by events it had no way of anticipating. The chaos of weather could fracture a naval force beyond repair, a problem land armies almost never faced. A terrestrial army might be slowed or scattered by a storm, but its components remain on the same solid earth. They can send out scouts to find each other, follow the same road, or simply wait for the weather to clear and regroup. The sea offered no such luxury. The classic example is the massive Persian invasion force sent by King Xerxes against Greece in 480 B.C.E. Historians like Herodotus describe how a ferocious storm struck the Persian fleet as it was anchored off the coast of Magnesia. The hurricane-force winds smashed hundreds of ships against the rocky shoreline, utterly destroying them. But beyond the immediate physical destruction, the storm had a second, more insidious effect. It scattered the surviving vessels across the Aegean Sea. With no means of communication, the Persian admirals had no idea which ships had survived, where they were, or how to reassemble them into a cohesive fighting force. This disorganization and loss of coordination critically weakened the navy before it ever faced the Greek triremes at Salamis. The storm didn't just sink ships, it dissolved the very command structure of the invasion, turning a unified armada into a collection of confused and isolated fragments, each one vulnerable and alone. This isolation acted as a force multiplier for every other danger we've discussed. A minor leak was a manageable problem for a crew working near shore with the hope of reaching a friendly port. That same leak, on a ship in the middle of the ocean with no hope of rescue, became a terrifying countdown to a certain death. A quarrel among the crew that might have been quelled by the authority of a nearby commanding vessel could fester into a full-blown mutiny when the sailors knew they were the only law on 1,000 square miles of water. A captain falling ill was a tragedy on land. At sea, with no one to consult and no higher authority to assume command, it could plunge the entire mission into paralysis and despair. The knowledge that you were truly, utterly on your own transformed every challenge into a potential catastrophe. There was no safety net, no cavalry waiting over the hill. The silent, empty horizon wasn't just a view. It was a prison wall reminding every soul on board that their fate was now entirely sealed within the wooden walls of their vessel, a tiny speck of humanity completely at the mercy of an indifferent and infinite sea. Beyond the tangible threats of storms and starvation, the ancient mariner navigated a sea teeming with invisible terrors, a world where the line between reality and nightmare was washed away by the salt spray. For civilizations like the Greeks, the sea was not merely a body of water. It was the domain of Poseidon, a moody and violent god whose trident could stir the ocean into a world-ending fury. To the north, Norse sailors whispered of the Kraken, a monstrous leviathan so vast its rising could create whirlpools capable of dragging entire longships and their crews into the crushing blackness of the abyss. These were not just campfire stories, they were a fundamental part of the cultural and psychological landscape, a way of explaining the terrifying and inexplicable power of the deep. Every strange ripple on the water, every log that looked momentarily like a coiled serpent, every unexplained disappearance of a vessel, these events were filtered through a lens of profound supernatural dread, confirming the existence of monsters that waited just beyond the edge of the known world. This mythological framework had direct and powerful consequences on the practical decisions of sailors, merchants, and kings. Certain stretches of water became notoriously avoided not because of charted reefs, but because of legendary associations. The Strait of Messina, a narrow and turbulent channel between Italy and Sicily, was feared as the home of Scylla and Charybdis from Homer's Odyssey, a six-headed monster on one side and a deadly whirlpool on the other. Captains would add days to a journey to sail around Sicily rather than risk the passage, a decision that cost precious time, food, and water, all to avoid a mythological threat that felt utterly real. The morale of a crew was a fragile thing, and a single ill omen, a sudden squall seen as divine anger, or a shark following the ship interpreted as a death omen, could spark panic and mutiny among men who believed they had angered the gods of the deep. This cultural dread acted as an invisible tax on exploration and trade, creating psychological barriers that were as effective as any physical wall in limiting the scope of the ancient world. The fear on land, while potent, was of a different character entirely. A Roman general might consult the augurs before a battle, examining the flight patterns of birds or the entrails of a sacrificed animal for signs of divine favor. But these omens were part of a calculated, almost bureaucratic religious system. The gods of the battlefield, like Mars, were figures of strength and strategy, their favor something that could be earned through ritual and offering. The land itself was knowable, its forests, while dark, could be mapped and its rivers forded. The sea, by stark contrast, was a realm of pure mystery. Its depths were unknowable, its sheer scale incomprehensible. The monsters believed to dwell there were not just symbols of danger, they were the physical embodiment of the ocean's chaotic, unpredictable, and utterly alien nature. This made the terror of the sea feel more primal, more personal, and far more inescapable. You could flee a losing land battle, but you could not flee the ocean itself once you were upon it. This deep-seated cultural fear created a powerful conservative force that actively stifled maritime ambition for centuries. Why sail into the western unknown, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, when every story said that was where the world ended and sea monsters dragged ships over the edge into oblivion? The philosophical and financial cost of overcoming this collective anxiety was immense. a ruler contemplating a naval expedition had to contend not only with the material costs of ships and supplies, but also with the whispered fears of his people and his own superstitious doubts. Launching a fleet was an act that risked provoking divine wrath as much as it risked encountering a storm. This pervasive dread meant that maritime technology and exploration advanced at a glacial pace compared to land-based endeavors. The ocean remained the final frontier of the ancient world, not just because of its physical dangers, but because humanity had first to conquer the terrifying kingdom of the mind, a battle against monsters that were, in many ways, far more formidable than any human enemy with a sword. But to truly grasp the scale of the sea's deadliness, we need to move beyond stories and examine the cold, hard numbers. When we compare the statistical toll of maritime disasters to the casualties of ancient land battles, a stark and unsettling pattern emerges. The ocean possessed a terrifying efficiency in claiming human life, often accomplishing in a single, catastrophic event what might take a major land campaign months or even years to achieve. Consider one of the most infamous military disasters in Roman history, the loss of 2 entire fleets during the First Punic War, in the year 255 BCE. A powerful Roman armada of over 300 ships, returning victorious from Africa, was struck by a sudden and violent storm off the rocky coast of Camarina in Sicily. The ancient historian Polybius reports that not a single ship survived. The loss of life was staggering, estimated to be well over 100,000 men, soldiers, rowers, and sailors, all swallowed by the sea in a matter of hours. This wasn't a defeat, it was an annihilation, an entire military force erased from existence not by enemy swords, but by the weather. Now, contrast this with the bloodiest single day of battle in perhaps all of Roman history, the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE. There, the brilliant Carthaginian general Hannibal managed to surround and systematically destroy a massive Roman army. The figures are horrifying. Around 50,000 Roman and Allied soldiers were killed in that single, sun-baked day. The scale of the loss was unprecedented and sent a shockwave of terror through the entire Roman state. Yet, from a purely statistical perspective, the Camarina storm disaster just a few decades earlier had claimed more than double that number of lives in a fraction of the time. A land battle of Cannae's magnitude was a rare, generation-defining catastrophe. A fleet-destroying storm, however, was a recurring nightmare. These maritime calamities could happen with a dreadful regularity, their cumulative death toll over decades quietly surpassing the most infamous battlefield defeats, yet often receiving far less attention in the historical record, precisely because they lack the dramatic narrative of a clash between great generals. This statistical reality is further compounded by the nature of the victims. Land warfare, for all its brutality, was primarily a contest between combatants. The legions at Cannae were made up of soldiers who had chosen, or been conscripted into, a life of war. The casualties, while tragic, were largely confined to this military class. The sea, however, was a far more democratic and indiscriminate killer. A sunken merchant vessel could claim the lives of its crew, yes, but also those of the merchant's family traveling with him, their servants, and even diplomats or scholars hitching a ride. A grain ship lost in a gale meant the deaths of not just sailors, but farmers, traders, and bureaucrats, the very non-combatants who formed the backbone of civilian society and economic life. The ocean made no distinction between a legionary and a linen merchant, between a general and a child passenger. This broad-spectrum lethality meant that a single maritime disaster could cripple a city's economy by wiping out a significant portion of its skilled traders and seafarers, creating a ripple effect of poverty and social collapse that extended far beyond the immediate loss of life. This is why ancient states, from Rome to Carthage to Athens, often viewed major naval commitments with such profound trepidation. Sending an army to a foreign land was a calculated risk. Sending a fleet into the open Mediterranean was, statistically speaking, a gamble with the very lives that powered their civilization, a roll of the dice against an opponent that never, ever lost. If you wanted to create a perfect historical case study to illustrate the ultimate power of the sea over human ambition, you would be hard-pressed to find a better example than the catastrophic Athenian expedition to Sicily. This was not a minor raid or a simple miscalculation. It was the equivalent of a modern superpower deciding to invade a continent on the other side of the world, betting its entire existence on a single, colossal gamble. In the year 413 BCE, at the height of the Peloponnesian War against Sparta, Athens launched what was arguably the most magnificent naval force ever assembled in the ancient Greek world. Their target was the powerful city of Syracuse on the island of Sicily, a rich and distant prize that promised to bring Athens immense wealth and a decisive strategic advantage. The fleet that set sail was a breathtaking display of Athenian confidence and naval mastery. Over 200 triremes, the advanced warships of the era, accompanied by countless transport vessels. On board were more than 40,000 men, not just highly trained rowers and marines, but also skilled craftsmen, cavalrymen, and the very best of Athens's young aristocratic leadership. The city had essentially sent its entire next generation of thinkers, fighters, and leaders on this one mission. As the citizens watched this immense armada depart from the harbor of Perils, it must have seemed that victory was not just possible, but inevitable. They were the masters of the sea, and the sea would carry them to glory. The initial stages of the campaign were marked by frustrating indecision and failed attacks, but the true turning point was not a glorious land battle. It was a naval engagement within the very harbor of Syracuse itself. The Syracusans, with help from their Spartan allies, had cleverly fortified the great harbor, blocking the entrance with a line of sunken ships and chained booms. The confident Athenians suddenly found their legendary fleet, their one unbeatable weapon, trapped. They were no longer the hunters, they were prey, caged within a narrow body of water. In a desperate, all-or-nothing battle, the Athenians threw their entire fleet against the Syracusan blockades, but the confined space of the harbor neutralized their superior seamanship. The normally agile triremes became entangled in the narrows, crashing into each other and the enemy's fortified positions. The battle devolved into a brutal, close-quarters slaughter from which the Athenian navy, the very heart of its empire, never recovered. Their ships were systematically destroyed or captured. The survivors, those tens of thousands of men who had sailed with such high hopes, now found themselves stranded on a hostile shore, hundreds of miles from home, with no means of escape and no navy to protect them. The sea, which had been their highway to conquest, had instantly transformed into their inescapable prison walls. What followed was one of the most harrowing and tragic retreats in all of military history. The Athenians, now led by the general Demosthenes, attempted a desperate overland escape, but they were weak, demoralized, and constantly harassed by Syracusan cavalry and light troops. The route was long, and they had no supply lines. Their situation rapidly deteriorated from dire to apocalyptic. The once proud army disintegrated into a starving, diseased mob. Men collapsed from exhaustion and hunger, left to die by the side of the trail. Those who fell behind were cut down by their pursuers. The streams they came across became sites of horrific massacres as the Syracusans slaughtered the dehydrated Athenians as they scrambled for a drink. In the end, the entire force was either killed or captured. The Athenians who were taken prisoner did not face a humane captivity. they were thrown into the infamous stone quarries of Syracuse, where they were exposed to the brutal sun and received minimal food and water. Thucydides, the great historian who chronicled this war, reports that the survivors in the quarries endured unimaginable suffering, packed together in a cramped, sun-baked pit, slowly perishing from their wounds, disease, and starvation. The mighty expeditionary force had been utterly erased not in a fair fight, but through a slow, agonizing process of starvation and execution facilitated by their loss of the sea. The ultimate consequence of this maritime disaster was nothing less than the downfall of an empire. The loss of those 40,000 men and over 200 ships was a blow from which Athens never recovered. The city was financially bankrupt and, more critically, had lost an entire generation of its military and political talent. The confidence that had defined the Athenian spirit was shattered. For the remaining years of the Peloponnesian War, Athens was on the defensive, its power broken. It was only a matter of time before the Spartans, with their new Persian-funded navy, would deliver the final blow. The Sicilian expedition stands as the ultimate testament to the sea's role as a strategic adversary. No Spartan phalanx, no matter how disciplined, could have single-handedly destroyed Athenian power so completely. It was the loss of naval supremacy and the subsequent isolation and starvation imposed by the geography of the sea that accomplished what no land army ever could. The harbor of Syracuse became a perfect trap, and the Mediterranean Sea, which had built the Athenian Empire, became the instrument of its ruin, proving that the waves could topple a golden age without a single sword needing to be drawn in a traditional, honorable battle. Even the most powerful empires of antiquity were forced to bow to the calendar, their ambitions shackled by the relentless cycle of the seasons. For ancient mariners, the year was brutally divided into two distinct periods, the precious window of safe sailing and the long, dreaded mare clausum, the closed sea. This was not a mere suggestion or a guideline, it was a fundamental law of survival. From approximately November through March, the Mediterranean Sea transformed from a highway of commerce into a tempestuous death trap. The winter months brought not just storms, but a specific type of gale that ancient shipwrights had no answer for: prolonged, violent winds that could churn the sea for days on end, waves growing to heights that would easily overwhelm the low freeboard of a trireme or merchant galley. To set sail during this forbidden season was seen not as an act of bravery, but of profound folly, a direct challenge to the gods of the wind and waves that was almost certain to be punished with destruction. This imposed calendar created a desperate, high-pressure race against time that dictated the rhythm of the entire ancient world. A merchant who missed the final autumn departure of the fleet from Alexandria to Rome knew that his goods would languish in a warehouse for months, missing crucial market opportunities and potentially ruining him. A general receiving orders for a spring campaign in a distant province had to coordinate the movement of troops, supplies, and warships with the precision of a master clockmaker, knowing that a delay of even a few weeks could mean arriving too late to matter, or worse, being caught at sea by the first autumn storm. This temporal tyranny, as we might call it, forced commanders into impossible gambles. Do we launch the invasion now, even though our scouts haven't returned, because we cannot afford to wait until next year? Do we send this last grain ship, even though the weather looks questionable, because the city will starve without it? These were decisions weighed in human lives, and the sea provided no room for error. The contrast with land-based logistics was stark and deeply frustrating for ancient strategists. A Roman legion on the German frontier didn't pack up and go home for the winter. They built a fortified camp, donned their heavy wool sagum cloaks, and continued their patrols and policing actions. Their supply trains, while slowed by mud and snow, could still operate along paved roads. Warfare might become a slower, more grueling affair of sieges and raids, but it did not cease entirely. The sea, however, imposed a complete and total shutdown. This inflexibility is perfectly illustrated by the infamous fate of Pope Gregory the Great's missionary expedition to England in the late 6th century. Upon seeing Anglo-Saxon slaves in a Roman market and famously quipping, "Non angli, sed angeli," not angles but angels, he was inspired to send a group of monks to convert them. His first attempt was launched too late in the year. The unprepared monks took one look at the worsening weather, the terrifying waves, and promptly lost their nerve, turning back before they had even left sight of Italy. The entire holy mission had to be postponed for months, not because of enemy action, but because the seasonal clock had run out. This relentless pressure to beat the clock led directly to some of history's most catastrophic and ill-prepared voyages. Ships were launched with green, untested crews hastily assembled to meet a deadline. Vessels were sent to sea with inadequate repairs, their hulls still leaking and their rigging frayed because there was no time for proper maintenance. Most tragically of all, captains were forced to make the heart-wrenching decision to set sail into visibly deteriorating weather, gambling that their skill and their prayers could see them through a storm that they knew, in their hearts, they should have waited out. The sea, already a deadly adversary, became exponentially more so because humanity was constantly racing against it, trying to squeeze a year's worth of ambition into a few short, frantic months of safe passage. This added a unique psychological dimension to the danger, the anxiety of the ticking clock, the fear of missing the window, and the desperate, often fatal, risks taken by those who pushed their luck against a force of nature that never, ever hurried. Now imagine a danger that combined the terror of a storm with the finality of a sinking, but with a uniquely horrifying twist, the threat of being trapped inside an inferno with nowhere to run. On the open ocean, far from any help, a fire on board an ancient ship was a catastrophe that almost guaranteed a horrific end. These vessels were essentially floating bundles of kindling. Their hulls were made of dry, aged timber, caulked with flammable pitch and tar to keep out water. The sails, massive sheets of linen or canvas, were treated with oils and resins to withstand the elements, making them highly combustible. Below decks, stores of lamp oil, cooking fat, and even the grain cargo itself could feed a blaze. A single spark from a galley fire used for cooking, a carelessly placed lantern, or a stray arrow wrapped in burning pitch during combat could spell doom for everyone on board. The physics of a shipboard fire made it a uniquely unwinnable battle. Unlike on land, where you could simply run away from a spreading blaze, a ship was a confined, isolated world. There was no outside to escape to, only the endless, uncaring sea. The very act of fighting the fire could accelerate the disaster. Buckets of seawater thrown onto the flames would often just scatter burning embers and splinters across the deck, igniting new spot fires faster than the crew could contain them. The heat would be intense and inescapable, causing the pitch between the hull planks to melt and drip like flaming rain, spreading the fire downward into the very bones of the ship. Within minutes, the vessel could be transformed from a sturdy vessel into a blazing funeral pyre, the air thick with smoke and the screams of men faced with an impossible choice: burn alive on the deck or leap into the shark-infested, unknown depths. This was a calculated risk with every voyage, a silent passenger of potential doom that made the simple act of lighting a cooking fire a moment of anxiety. The use of fire as a deliberate weapon only heightened this terror, turning the sea itself into a battlefield of flame. The most famous example is the Greek victory at the Battle of Salamis. According to the historian Herodotus, the Athenian general Themistocles devised a cunning strategy. He lured the massive, less maneuverable Persian fleet into the narrow straits, and then unleashed a squadron of fire ships, older vessels packed with combustibles, set ablaze, and deliberately sailed into the heart of the enemy formation. The result was pandemonium. The Persian ships, crammed together in the tight space, had no room to evade these floating torches. Their wooden hulls, dry sails, and rigging caught fire almost instantly. The narrow waters became a hellish scene of colliding, burning vessels, with panicked sailors leaping into the water to avoid the flames, only to drown under the weight of their armor or be cut down by Greek arrows. This tactical use of fire demonstrated its supreme effectiveness in naval warfare. It wasn't just about sinking ships, but about creating a psychological weapon of mass terror that could break the will of an entire fleet faster than any ramming maneuver. The stark difference between a fire on land and a fire at sea highlights why this danger was so uniquely maritime. If a campfire got out of control in an army camp, soldiers could simply move their tents and form a bucket brigade, using earth to smother the flames. The ground itself was a tool for containment. On a ship, every element worked against the crew. The wind, essential for propulsion, became a deadly accomplice to the fire, fanning the flames and driving them forward. The very structure of the ship, designed to be watertight, instead acted like an oven, trapping heat and smoke and ensuring the blaze consumed everything in its path. There were no fire-resistant materials, no emergency protocols beyond frantic bucketing, and certainly no hope of a fire brigade arriving. This ever-present threat of a swift and inescapable conflagration meant that every captain and every sailor lived with a low-level dread that a single moment of carelessness could transform their floating home into a death trap, a finality far more gruesome and terrifying than the quick steel of a sword. But beyond the storms and the fires, the sea held another kind of terror, one that swam in its dark, unseen depths. For the ancient sailor, the ocean was not an empty void, it was a realm populated by monsters. While actual attacks by giant squid or sharks were incredibly rare, the fear of them was a constant, gnawing anxiety. Tales of leviathans and sea serpents were not mere superstition, they were a logical response to a genuinely terrifying environment. A sudden shadow passing beneath the hull, a strange, unidentified creature breaching in the distance, or the sheer, unknown vastness of the abyss below, these were all it took to ignite a panic that could spread through a crew like wildfire. This dread had very real consequences. A sighting of what we might now recognize as a harmless whale or a large basking shark could be misinterpreted as a monstrous omen, causing a captain to make a reckless decision, like altering course into a known storm track or refusing to sail through certain straits altogether, just to avoid the imagined beasts that lurked there. The most devastating marine life, however, was not a giant predator but a tiny, almost invisible one, the shipworm. These clam-like mollusks, known scientifically as Teredo navalis, were a silent scourge that could doom a vessel without any warning. A ship's hull, sitting in warm, tropical waters for even a short time, could become infested. The shipworms would bore into the wood, creating a labyrinth of tunnels as they devoured the timber from the inside out. From the outside, the hull might appear perfectly sound, its seams tight and its planks solid, but internally, it was being transformed into a fragile honeycomb, its structural integrity slowly eaten away. A captain and his crew could be sailing confidently in open water when a moderate wave, the kind a healthy ship would shrug off, would strike the compromised hull. The wood, riddled with thousands of tiny holes, could simply give way, bursting open and flooding the ship in minutes. This was a particularly insidious form of betrayal. The very home that protected them from the sea was being consumed by it, leaving them vulnerable to a sudden and catastrophic failure with no enemy in sight. For any unfortunate soul who ended up in the water, the dangers were even more immediate and personal. In the warm waters of the Indian Ocean or the Red Sea, a sailor who fell overboard during a maneuver risked an agonizing encounter with jellyfish, their nearly invisible tentacles delivering searing, paralyzing stings that could lead to a painful death by drowning. Tropical reefs held beautifully colored but deadly stonefish or lionfish, whose venomous spines could cause excruciating pain, shock, and paralysis. A simple swim to retrieve a dropped item or to cool off could turn deadly in an instant. Unlike on land, where a soldier might watch for snakes in the grass or wolves in the forest, the ocean's threats were hidden beneath a deceptively calm surface, their nature and location completely unknown. A seemingly empty patch of water could hold a creature whose very touch was fatal. This combination of real biological threats and imagined mythological ones created a unique layer of psychological warfare that the sea waged on the minds of sailors. A wolf on land was a known quantity. Its habits could be learned, its territory avoided. But what were the habits of a kraken? How did one avoid the lair of a many-headed sailor? The ocean's inhabitants, both real and imagined, were shrouded in mystery and exaggeration, making every voyage a journey into a world of amplified anxiety. This deep-seated fear of the unknown lurking beneath the waves became a powerful mental barrier, another reason to cling to the safety of the coastline and dread the vast, open deep where the monsters of both legend and reality were waiting. This pervasive, deeply ingrained fear of the open ocean created a powerful and often invisible brake on the progress of entire civilizations. The incredible risks associated with blue water sailing fostered a culture of profound conservatism among ancient mariners and the merchants who funded them. Why gamble everything on a voyage into the terrifying emptiness of the Western Mediterranean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, when every story and song warned that those waters were the domain of sea monsters and the very edge of the world, where ships would simply sail off into oblivion? This wasn't just superstition. It was a rational response to an environment that had consistently demonstrated its capacity for utter, merciless destruction. The result was that for centuries, the vast majority of maritime travel was confined to cabotage, hugging the coastline, moving from one familiar headland to the next, always keeping land in sight as a psychological and navigational lifeline. This severely limited the scope of exploration, trade, and the exchange of ideas that fueled technological and cultural advancement. Contrast this with the steady, incremental progress of land exploration. A Roman general pushing into Germania or a Carthaginian trader venturing across the Sahara faced immense dangers, from hostile tribes to harsh terrain. But these challenges were different in kind. On land, the risks were more manageable and the progress was controllable. An army could build a fortified camp each night, establishing a secure base from which to operate. Scouts could be sent ahead to assess the lay of the land and report back on potential threats or resources. If they encountered a mountain range that was too treacherous, they could find a pass or chart a course around it. The knowledge gained was cumulative and could be mapped, shared, and built upon by the next wave of explorers. This methodical, step-by-step expansion allowed for the steady development of better equipment, from improved wagon axles to more durable marching sandals, each innovation building on the last in a clear progression. At sea, no such incremental learning was possible. A voyage into the unknown was a binary, all-or-nothing gamble. There were no halfway points, no friendly ports to restock in the middle of the Atlantic. A ship and its crew were entirely on their own, and failure meant not just a setback, but the total and complete loss of all hands, all cargo, and all knowledge of what they might have encountered. This terrifying finality stifled innovation. Why invest vast sums of money to experiment with a new hull design or a novel rigging system when the first real-world test could send your entire investment and its crew to the bottom of the sea? This created a vicious cycle. The dangers of the sea inspired extreme caution, and that caution prevented the development of the very technologies, sturdier ships, more reliable navigation tools, better food preservation methods, that could have mitigated those same dangers. Naval technology remained remarkably static for hundreds of years, not for a lack of imagination, but because the cost of failure was too catastrophic to bear. The sea, which held the promise of connecting continents and creating vast networks of wealth, instead became a barrier, its very perils ensuring that humanity's reach would, for a very long time, never exceed its grasp. Yet for all their ferocity, these inland waterways offered one crucial advantage that the open ocean never could: the nearness of land itself. A vessel capsized by a sudden squall on Lake Geneva might see its crew swept toward a shoreline where local fishermen could attempt a rescue. A Roman supply barge snagged on a submerged tree in the Tiber could signal for help from soldiers stationed at a nearby fort. This proximity to potential aid fundamentally changed the psychology of river and lake travel. The threat of disaster was ever present, but the specter of total, irreversible annihilation that haunted deep-sea sailors was significantly diminished. There was always a chance, however slim, that someone on the riverbank might see you, that you could swim to safety, or that your wrecked vessel would be found. This possibility of rescue, however faint, made these waters feel less like an absolute, indifferent void and more like a challenging, albeit dangerous, extension of the human world. The risks were managed, the dangers were known, and the consequences, while severe, were rarely as final as being swallowed by the trackless, empty expanse of the ocean. This critical distinction in the perception of danger is perfectly illustrated by one of Julius Caesar's most famous military engineering feats, the bridging of the Rhine River. Caesar's armies were masters of land warfare, but the Rhine represented a formidable natural and psychological barrier, a waterway teeming with Germanic tribes who used the river both as a defensive moat and a highway for their own raids. To cross it with his legions, Caesar didn't attempt a risky amphibious assault using boats, which would have left his men desperately vulnerable to attack from the far shore. Instead, he ordered the construction of a massive wooden bridge, a stunning feat of engineering completed in just 10 days. This decision speaks volumes about the Roman relationship with riverine danger. The river itself was a threat to be overcome with technology and sheer force of will, a problem with a solution. They could literally build a road over the danger. Such a solution was utterly inconceivable for the Mediterranean Sea. You could not build a bridge across the ocean. The Rhine was an obstacle, the sea was an abyss. This fundamental difference in scale and character is why ancient peoples, from Egyptian farmers to Celtic traders, reserved their deepest, most profound dread for the open ocean, viewing even the wildest rivers as tameable forces in comparison. Now imagine the profound helplessness of being in the middle of that vast, empty ocean with no reliable way to know where you are, or even which way you should go. For ancient mariners, this was not a hypothetical fear. It was the daily reality of navigation, a constant battle against the limits of their own technology. Their most advanced tools, the astrolabe and the camel, were marvels of their age, but they shared one catastrophic flaw. They were utterly dependent on clear skies. The astrolabe, a complex brass ring used to measure the angle of the sun or a star above the horizon, required a steady hand and a visible celestial body. On the deck of a ship being tossed by waves, taking an accurate reading was nearly impossible. The simpler camel used by Arab navigators was just a rectangular piece of wood with a string. The sailor would hold the wood at arm's length, lining up the North Star with the horizon, and use knots in the string to estimate latitude. But if clouds rolled in for just a few hours, these tools transformed from instruments of guidance into useless pieces of wood and metal, leaving the crew blind and adrift. This technological gap created a terrifying vulnerability that land travelers simply did not face. A Roman legionary lost in a forest in Gaul could still find his way. He could follow a river downstream, knowing it would eventually lead to a settlement. He could observe the moss growing on the north side of trees, or simply backtrack his own footsteps. The land itself was a map filled with clues and reference points. For a sailor, the ocean was a perfect, featureless blank. There were no landmarks, no mossy trees, no footprints to follow. Once the coastline disappeared from view, the only points of reference were the sun by day and the stars by night. If those were obscured by cloud cover for several days, a common occurrence, the ship entered a state of pure navigational drift. The crew could only guess their direction based on the wind and the feel of the currents, a method so unreliable it was little better than superstition. This meant that every extended voyage into open water was, in essence, a leap of faith, a journey into a void where a single overcast week could mean the difference between reaching a prosperous trading port and sailing obliviously past it into a watery grave. The consequences of this navigational helplessness were often tragic and absurd. There are accounts from the ancient world of ships intending to sail from Crete to Egypt, a journey of a few hundred miles, being blown off course by a storm, and after days of cloudy skies, accidentally making landfall on the coast of Libya or even further west, having no idea where they were. The famous story of the Greek merchant Pytheas, who claimed to have reached a frozen northern land he called Thule, was likely the result of just such a navigational error, pushed far off his intended course by currents and unable to correct it without celestial guidance. This inability to accurately chart a position or plot a reliable course meant that ancient maps were often works of imagination rather than science, filled with mythical islands and sea monsters where accurate data should have been. The sea remained the greatest unknown on Earth not because it was unexplored, but because those who ventured out onto it often lacked the basic tools to report back with any certainty where they had been. This fundamental ignorance turned every voyage into a potential one-way trip into the unknown, a gamble with fate that underscored the ocean's ultimate authority over the ambitions of humankind. Now consider the monumental challenge of keeping a naval force alive and operational, not for days but for months at a time across thousands of miles of open water. For an ancient admiral, the true enemy was often not the rival fleet waiting over the horizon, but the simple, grinding arithmetic of consumption. Every single person on every ship required a daily ration of food and, even more critically, fresh water. A large fleet could comprise hundreds of vessels carrying thousands of men, all of them consuming supplies at a relentless, predictable rate. This turned the entire naval expedition into a race against a ticking clock, where the success of a military campaign hinged on the precise coordination of supply chains that were terrifyingly fragile. A land army, no matter how large, had options. It could forage from the countryside, requisition grain from local villages, or hunt game. Its soldiers could drink from rivers and streams. A fleet had no such luxury. The ocean offered nothing to eat and nothing to drink. Every mouthful of water, every bite of hardtack, every piece of salted meat had to be meticulously packed into the ship's hold at the start of the journey or acquired at predetermined points along the way. This absolute dependence on pre-arranged supply made naval power uniquely vulnerable to disruption in a way that land power never was. This logistical nightmare is perfectly illustrated by the struggles of one of history's greatest military minds, Alexander the Great. During his campaign in the Indus Valley, his massive fleet, commanded by his admiral Nearchus, was tasked with sailing along the uncharted and hostile coast of what is now Pakistan and India. The mission was a logistical disaster in the making. The maps were unreliable, the coastal communities were often openly hostile, and the landscape itself was parched and unforgiving. The fleet was constantly on the brink of catastrophe. Finding fresh water was a daily struggle. They would land parties on shore to dig wells in likely-looking spots, only to frequently find brackish, undrinkable water. Friendly ports where they could resupply were almost non-existent. Instead, they faced suspicious locals who were unwilling to trade or, worse, actively attacked the foraging parties. The situation grew so desperate that the crews began to rebel, their morale broken not by enemy action, but by the constant, gnawing fear of starvation and thirst. Alexander's legendary army on land could live off the riches of the empires it conquered, but his navy was starving within sight of the shore, a testament to the sea's unique ability to strangle a military operation through sheer logistical isolation. The contrast with land-based logistics could not be more stark. A Roman legion on the march through Gaul was a model of self-sufficient mobility. Its soldiers carried several days' worth of rations in their packs, but the army as a whole was followed by a massive baggage train of mules and carts carrying additional supplies. More importantly, they operated in a landscape that could provide sustenance. They could harvest wheat from fields, requisition cattle from local farms, and set up hunting parties to bring in fresh game. If they needed to establish a long-term presence, they could build a fortified camp and create a supply depot, a secure node in their logistical network. The fleet had none of these options. There was no foraging in the open ocean. There were no fields of grain to harvest, no herds of cattle to requisition. A ship could not carry a baggage train. Its entire world, its entire future, was contained within its own wooden walls. Once those stores were depleted, the only hope was to find a safe, friendly harbor, a hope that was often dashed on rocky, uninhabited coastlines or hostile shores. This logistical fragility meant that a naval campaign could collapse from within without a single enemy ship ever appearing on the horizon, defeated not by swords and spears, but by empty stomachs and dry water jars. Picture the aftermath of a shipwreck, the violent storm having passed, leaving behind an eerie, unsettling calm. If you were one of the few who managed to cling to a piece of floating debris, your ordeal was only just beginning. You are now adrift on an endless, flat expanse of water, under a sun that offers no shade or a night sky that provides no warmth. There is no fresh water to drink, and the surrounding ocean is a cruel paradox, a vast desert of undrinkable saltwater that will only accelerate your dehydration and madness. There is no food, save for the desperate, nearly impossible task of catching a fish with your bare hands. There is no sign of land in any direction, and perhaps most chillingly, there is absolutely no hope of rescue. In the ancient world, the concept of a coordinated search for a lost ship simply did not exist. Once a vessel disappeared over the horizon, it vanished from the world's awareness. No fleet would be dispatched to scour the sea lanes. No friendly ports would be alerted to watch for survivors. You were, in the most literal sense, alone in the universe, waiting for a death that could take days of agonizing thirst or a sudden, final descent into the depths. This utter hopelessness is what makes the biblical story of St. Paul's shipwreck on Malta so remarkable. As recounted in the Acts of the Apostles, Paul was being transported to Rome as a prisoner when his ship was caught in a legendary tempest, a 14-day storm that drove them across the entire Adriatic Sea. The ship was eventually destroyed on the reefs of Malta, yet through a combination of skillful seamanship and sheer luck, all 276 people on board managed to make it to shore. This story was told and retold precisely because it was a miracle, a statistical anomaly so rare it demanded a divine explanation. For every St. Paul and his crew, there were thousands of other shipwrecks that left no one to tell the tale. The sea didn't just kill, it erased. It swallowed ships, cargo, and human lives without leaving a single piece of evidence behind. A family waiting for a trader to return would never know if he died in a storm, was taken by pirates, or simply sailed off the edge of the world. They were left with a silent, haunting uncertainty that could last a lifetime. Contrast this desolate end with the fate of a wounded soldier on an ancient battlefield. If a Roman legionary fell at the height of combat, his body might be left where it lay. But if he was merely wounded, there was a system, however rudimentary, for recovery. His comrades in his century might drag him back from the front lines to a field medic. If the army was forced to retreat, they would often make an effort to retrieve their wounded. And if a soldier was left for dead, he might still be found by local villagers scavenging the battlefield for spoils, who might offer him water or shelter in exchange for information or a promise of reward. On land, there was always a chance, however small, of a second act. The landscape itself held potential for survival: streams to drink from, caves to hide in, roads that might lead to a friendly town. The sea offered no such mercy. It was a perfect, self-cleaning grave. A survivor in the water had no comrades to carry him, no hiding places to seek, and no paths to follow. The complete and total finality of a maritime disaster added a unique layer of psychological terror to the experience of ancient sailing, a chilling knowledge that a single mistake would be your last, and that the world would never even know how you died. This constant, looming threat of total loss forced the ancient world to invent something remarkable: the earliest known systems of insurance and risk management. Faced with the ocean's utter indifference to human ambition, merchants and bankers had to get creative to make commerce even remotely viable. The most famous of these early financial instruments was the Greek bottomry loan, a brilliant but brutally expensive solution. Here's how it worked. A merchant who needed to fund a voyage would borrow money from a wealthy lender, but this wasn't a normal loan. The lender would only be repaid if the ship successfully completed its journey. If the vessel sank or was captured by pirates, the debt was completely wiped away. For shouldering this enormous risk, the lender charged exorbitant interest rates, sometimes as high as 30%. This system essentially functioned as a primitive insurance policy. The high interest was the premium, and the forgiven loan was the payout for a catastrophic loss. It was a direct financial acknowledgement of a simple, terrifying truth. Sending a ship to sea was one of the riskiest financial bets a person could make. The ripple effects of this system shaped the entire economy of maritime trade. Because bottomry loans were so expensive, they created a huge barrier to entry. Only the wealthiest merchants or syndicates of investors who could pool their resources could afford to underwrite these voyages. A small-time trader with a single ship and a dream stood little chance. One storm could wipe him out forever with no financial safety net. This concentrated wealth and power in the hands of a few, making maritime commerce an elite and highly speculative venture. It was the original high-risk, high-reward investment, a gamble where the sea always had an overwhelming advantage. The entire practice acknowledged that the sea was not just another trade route. It was a volatile and unpredictable force that could destroy capital as easily as it could create it. Contrast this with the risks of overland trade. A caravan traveling the Silk Road certainly faced dangers, bandits, harsh terrain, and extortionate tolls by local warlords. But these risks were different in kind. They were often manageable and, crucially, partial. Bandits might raid a caravan and steal a portion of its goods, but they were unlikely to destroy everything and kill every single person. A clever merchant could hide valuables, negotiate a ransom, or even hire a larger guard force to deter attack. The loss was often quantifiable and survivable. More importantly, the land itself offered some semblance of security and predictability. Routes were known, distances could be calculated, and help was sometimes available from nearby settlements or military outposts. The sea offered no such negotiating table. Its losses were almost always total, absolute, and final. A sunken ship meant a 100% loss of vessel, cargo, crew, and any hope of profit. This fundamental difference in the scale of potential disaster is why financial tools for land-based trade never needed to be as radical or as costly as the bottomry loan. The need to invent such a drastic mechanism underscores how the ancient world viewed the sea not merely as a challenge, but as an existential threat to economic stability, a force that required entirely new rules of finance just to engage with it. Faced with such an overwhelming and unpredictable adversary, ancient sailors turned to the only power they believed could possibly offer protection: the divine. This was not a matter of casual superstition, but a deeply ingrained system of faith and practice born from a place of profound human helplessness. On land, a warrior might pray to Ares or Mars for courage and victory, but he still held his sword and shield, trusting in his own strength and training to see him through. The relationship with the gods of the battlefield was often transactional, a vow made for a favor granted. But the sea was different. No amount of personal bravery, skill, or strength could calm a hurricane or reveal a hidden reef. The mariner's relationship with the divine was not one of negotiation, but of desperate supplication, a humble acknowledgement that their survival was entirely in the hands of forces far beyond their control. This spiritual dimension of seafaring manifested in elaborate and deeply ritualized practices that were woven into the very fabric of maritime life. Before a ship even left the safety of the harbor, sacrifices would be made to the relevant sea god. For the Greeks, this was Poseidon, the earth shaker, whose turbulent moods could either grant safe passage or dash a vessel to splinters. A prized bull or sheep might be slaughtered on the beach, its entrails examined for favorable omens before its blood was offered to the waves. Phoenician and Canaanite sailors prayed to Yam, a primordial and chaotic sea deity, hoping to appease his insatiable appetite. Libations of wine, oil, and precious perfumes were poured into the water as gifts, a tangible offering to an intangible and terrifying power. These were not empty gestures, they were essential pre-voyage preparations, as crucial as checking the rigging or loading supplies. To set sail without first securing divine favor was seen as the height of arrogance, an invitation for disaster. The rhythm of the maritime calendar itself was dictated by these religious observances. The Romans, ever practical in their piety, celebrated the Navigium Isides, the Ship of Isis festival, each spring to mark the official opening of the sailing season after the perilous winter closure. This was a grand, colorful procession where a model ship was carried through the streets to the temple of Isis, who was revered as a protector of sailors and a mistress of the sea. Priests, musicians, and devotees dressed in elaborate costumes would sing hymns and offer prayers, asking the goddess to bless the fleets and grant them fair winds and prosperous voyages. This was more than just a festival. It was a communal act of risk management, a way for an entire port city to collectively seek protection for its economic lifeblood before sending it into the jaws of the unknown. It publicly acknowledged that the fortunes of the state depended not just on naval might, but on the mercy of the gods. This spiritual surrender to the ocean's power created a unique maritime culture, one where piety and practicality were inextricably linked. The crew of a ship operated as a microcosm of this belief system. There were strict taboos aboard ship, words that could not be spoken for fear of attracting bad luck, and behaviors that were strictly prohibited. Whistling on board, for instance, was often forbidden, as it was believed to mimic the sound of the wind and could inadvertently summon a storm. Certain animals or people might be considered unlucky and barred from embarking. Every aspect of the voyage, from the launching of the ship to the daily routine, was accompanied by small prayers and rituals. This constant, low-level engagement with the divine was a psychological coping mechanism, a way to impose a sense of order and control on an environment that was fundamentally chaotic. It gave sailors a framework to understand the incomprehensible, why one ship survived a storm and another did not, and it provided a measure of comfort in the face of almost certain peril. The contrast with the confidence of land combat could not be more striking. A Roman general might take the auspices before a battle, but once the fighting began, he relied on the discipline of his legions and the strength of their formations. The outcome was seen as a reflection of human will and military skill, with the favor of the gods as just one factor in a complex equation. But on the sea, human will was meaningless. The finest captain with the most experienced crew could do nothing but pray when the sky turned black and the waves reached for the heavens. This fundamental difference is why the religious response to the sea was so much more intense, so much more deeply felt. It was a religion born not of conquest but of survival, not of dominance but of humility. These ancient rituals stand as a powerful testament to the human spirit, acknowledging our ultimate vulnerability while still finding the courage to set sail into the terrifying and beautiful unknown. Yet even in our modern age of satellite navigation, whether predicting supercomputers and steel-hulled leviathans, the sea has never truly been tamed. It remains a realm of immense power and profound danger, a fact tragically underscored by events like the sinking of the RMS Titanic in 1912. Here was the most advanced passenger liner of its era, deemed unsinkable by its creators, humbled on its maiden voyage by a single iceberg, sending over 1,500 people into the frigid North Atlantic. More recently, the mysterious disappearance of Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 over the Indian Ocean in 2014, and the catastrophic loss of the cargo ship El Faro in 2015 during Hurricane Joaquin despite having access to modern forecasting serve as chilling reminders. Technology has given us a greater sense of control, but it has not eliminated risk. The ocean still demands a healthy respect, and the ancient strategies of caution, preparation, and respect for the environment are not relics of a bygone era. They are timeless lessons written in water and blood. This historical perspective offers us more than just a fascinating glimpse into the past. It provides a crucial lens through which to view our own relationship with the natural world. The ancient mariners' understanding that human ambition must be tempered by humility is a lesson that resonates deeply today. In an age where we often believe our technology makes us invincible, the sea continues to teach us about the fragility of our endeavors. The principles of risk management pioneered by those Greek merchants taking out bottomry loans are the direct ancestors of our complex global insurance and shipping industries. Their desperate prayers to Poseidon before a voyage find a modern echo in the meticulous safety drills and emergency protocols practiced on every cruise ship and oil tanker. We have swapped sacrifices for simulations, but the core intent remains the same: to acknowledge the danger and prepare for it as best we can, understanding that some forces will always be beyond our control. Ultimately, exploring why the sea was more dangerous than the sword does more than just revise our understanding of history. It deepens our appreciation for the incredible courage of those who first ventured onto the waves. It was their voyages undertaken at immense personal risk that built the networks of trade and cultural exchange which eventually shaped the modern world. Every time we benefit from global commerce or marvel at the connectedness of our planet, we are enjoying the legacy of those ancient sailors who faced down unimaginable terrors. Their story is a powerful testament to human resilience and a humbling reminder that our greatest struggles have often been not against each other, but against the raw, untamed power of nature itself. This journey through the perils of the ancient seas leaves us with a profound respect for the past and a wiser, more measured perspective on the challenges we still face today. When we step back and view all these dangers together, a clear and terrifying picture emerges. The sea was not a single monster with one weapon. It was a hydra of horrors, each head representing a different way to die. A soldier on a battlefield faced a known adversary. He could see the enemy, gauge their strength, and rely on his training, his armor, and the man standing next to him. His world, though violent, was on a human scale. His death, if it came, was typically the result of a deliberate action by another person. The sea offered no such clarity or fairness. Its threats were multifaceted, impersonal, and often invisible. A voyage could be ended by a storm one day, by scurvy the next, or by the silent, gnawing work of shipworms the day after that. It was death by 1,000 cuts, each one delivered by a different aspect of the ocean's boundless hostility. No amount of bravery, no brilliance in swordsmanship, and no strength in numbers could provide a consistent defense against this endless onslaught of natural and logistical challenges. This is the core of the difference between the danger of the sword and the danger of the sea. Warfare was a contest of controlled chaos. The chaos was real: the blood, the noise, the confusion, but it was chaos orchestrated by human minds and limited by human endurance. A general could impose his will on a battlefield through strategy and discipline. The sea, by contrast, was chaos in its purest, most absolute form. It was an environment of immense, impersonal scale that operated by its own ancient and indifferent rules. It did not hate you, it did not even notice you. A fleet that had done everything right, favorable winds, skilled navigation, a healthy crew, could still be instantly annihilated by a rogue wave or an uncharted reef. There was no strategy to counter the weather, no formation to repel disease, and no armor thick enough to withstand the psychological torment of endless isolation. The sea could erase centuries of planning, millions of coins in investment, and thousands of lives without leaving a single trace behind, as if they had never existed at all. This fundamental unpredictability is what made maritime endeavors the ultimate gamble of the ancient world. A king could be relatively certain of the outcome of sending a legion to pacify a rebellious province. He knew the legion's strength, the enemy's capabilities, and the terrain. The variables were known. Sending a fleet to secure a new trade route or invade a distant shore was an entirely different proposition. The king was betting his treasure and his people against an opponent whose moves he could not predict and whose power he could not accurately measure. He was gambling against the weather, the currents, the stars, and the very structural integrity of wood and rope. The potential rewards were enormous: wealth, empire, glory. But the risks were so catastrophically high that they shaped history itself, causing rulers to hesitate, to scale back ambitions, and to pour resources into appeasing gods rather than training soldiers. The true cost of ancient expansion and trade wasn't just tallied in coins spent or lives lost in battle. It was measured in the silent, sinking dread of every merchant and admiral who knew that the greatest threat to their mission was not the enemy on the shore, but the endless, unknowable deep beneath their feet. Throughout history, the sea has been a relentless adversary, claiming more lives and fortunes than countless battles combined. From unpredictable storms to psychological torment, its dangers were multifaceted and often inescapable, shaping the rise and fall of civilizations. As we reflect on why the sea was more dangerous than the sword, we gain a deeper appreciation for the courage of those who braved it and the lessons they left behind. Let this exploration remind us of humanity's enduring struggle against nature's might. If you found this journey into historical mysteries enlightening, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more deep dives, and never